Welcome back, everyone, to my coaching program course. I'm Dr. Carrie Mankey, and this is part 4, Guilt and Shame. I want to first start by explaining the definitions of these words because it's really important that you understand the distinction between them. Some people use these words interchangeably, and I want to explain how they are different. So first, I want to explain what the definition of guilt means. Guilt is an awareness that you have done something wrong, or perceived that you did something wrong. It's saying, I made a mistake. This is actually a positive influence. So this is your healthy, guilty conscience that tells you whether something was right or wrong, and it helps fosters course correction and change. So when you have accidentally hurt someone, or maybe you stepped on some toes figuratively or realistically, and you say, oh, I made a mistake. Sorry, I stepped on you. Sorry, I bumped into you. This is what fosters that course correction. So it's saying, oh, maybe I shouldn't do that next time. Or maybe I should try to phrase something different so I don't hurt someone next time. This is a good thing. Most humans have a guilty conscience. It's a good thing. And it's basically just an awareness indicator of, I maybe made a mistake and I need to do something different. Shame, on the other hand, is a feeling that your whole self is wrong. So that feeling that you are unworthy of love, belonging, and connection. So instead of saying, I made a mistake, you are now saying, I am a mistake. Note the I am in that sentence. And this is a negative influence because it perpetuates a self-belief that is fundamentally inaccurate. You are not a mistake. There is nothing fundamentally wrong with you, and you are not unworthy of love. You are worthy. And I just want you to know that today. And so if you have feelings of shame, just know that that's very common with someone that has been through trauma. And we're going to talk why in a minute here. But just know that that's what we're going to work on in this module is figuring out how to really pull out that root of shame, because that's really what shame is. It's a root that gets in there. It usually starts out as a guilt, and then it can turn into shame if it's allowed to fester. And it's a really hard thing to tackle. It's probably the emotion that drives me the most crazy when I work with individuals or groups of people, because it's really hard to combat shame. There's a perpetual cycle you can get into with shame, and I'm going to talk about that later as well. So just know that if you are feeling shame in some capacity, that you're in the right place, and that's what we're going to work on today. Blame, on the other hand, is assigning responsibility toward someone or a situation for something. So a mistake was made and you are assigning responsibility to someone. So it can also be assigned to yourself, and that's where it can start to look like shame as well. If it turns into, oh, shoot, Carrie, you made a mistake, into I am a mistake. But it's basically pointing the finger at someone else. And this can be a positive or a negative influence. If it's communicated appropriately, it can foster healthy communication and relationships, which we'll talk about more in the relationships module, because it is helpful to point out to someone when they hurt you. But there are healthy ways to do that and healthy ways to set boundaries with those conversations. So stay tuned for that in the relationships and intimacy module. But I just want to go over what the difference is between these words so that we are on the same page as we go through this module. And then keeping in mind that you can feel guilt about something, about making a mistake, and not assign the blame to yourself for that. So you can say, oh, shoot, I probably shouldn't have done that. And you don't have to assign blame to yourself and say, like, you did something wrong. Because when you start to use that language and you're talking to yourself, that's when it starts to turn into shame. And we'll talk more about shame too. Brené Brown is one of my favorite authors on the topic of shame. I read a lot of her research as well. She's done a number of research studies and she speaks about this topic a lot. And I just really like these two quotes that she put together because they really embody what shame is. So first of all, shame corrodes the very part of us that believes we are capable of change. If you remember on that previous slide when we talked about guilt, that's when we are capable of change, when we recognize that we made a mistake and we can correct it. But when it switches into shame and we believe that we are the mistake, it's really hard to change. So that's why it's so hard to tackle shame and why we need to talk about it. Shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. And if that's you today, I just want to speak to you and say, I've been there. I know what that's like. During my abusive marriage, the things that were spoken over me were multiple times a day of, just you're ugly, you don't matter, nobody would want you, I don't know what's wrong with you, just constant phrases like that. And after a period of time, I believed those things about myself. So shame was something I really struggled with, and shame is very, very much linked to confidence and worthiness. And I just believed that I was unworthy of joy, unworthy of love, unworthy of happiness, anything in life really that had any good attached to it. I believed I was unworthy of that because I was flawed, just like this quote says. And so if you are feeling that way today, I just want you to know that it's a lie. It's a lie that you think that, and I understand why you think that. And you might say, oh, Dr. Carey, you don't really know me very well. Like, I really am unworthy of these things. I promise you that you are worthy of joy and love and belonging. And that's what I really want you to get out of this today, is that we need to dig out that root of shame. Shame is like a root. It goes so deep inside of us, and it's a really hard thing to tackle. So I'm really glad that you're here with me today so we can work through this. And some of these exercises might be really challenging, and that's okay, but that's why we're going to do them, to try to tackle and get that root out of shame. So this first exercise is the I am exercise, and it talks about core beliefs. And when I first did this, and you write down everything you fundamentally believe about yourself, I was shocked at some of the things I wrote. I wrote, I am a negative person. I wrote, I am beautiful, but then I also wrote, I'm unattractive. So I don't know how both of those were true, but I believed both of them about myself. And I definitely wrote down, I am unworthy of love. So I want you to start writing down just everything that comes to mind, and don't judge what you're writing down. Just let it flow, and you might be surprised, and some of them might contradict each other, and that's okay. Just whatever words come to mind, and this list might grow over the next several days as more come to mind. Just keep writing them down. Just write them all down. Anything that starts with an I am, anything you say about yourself, anything that you tell other people about yourself, or anything that you whisper under your breath to yourself that you don't want anybody else to know. All of those are I am statements and core beliefs. So just start writing those down. Now, how does blame and trauma go together? I mentioned this briefly in the triggers and flashbacks module, but we often blame ourselves for something related to our trauma. I explained that I blamed myself for not screaming when I was attacked at knife point, and for not trying to get away from the man who ended up raping me. And I think back, and I'm logically looking back saying, well, of course I didn't do those things. He had a knife to my throat. I probably would have died. I already ended up getting stabbed and was probably not going to live that night. So it's a good thing I didn't do those things. But this is very common to blame ourselves, even if it doesn't make logical sense. And so some of the things you might be saying to yourself were, I didn't stop it. I didn't scream. I should have left sooner. I say that all the time. I should have left my ex-husband sooner. Why did it take me so long to realize I was in such an unhealthy relationship? I let it happen to me. I've said that to myself as well. I'm a strong-willed female. And I am not somebody I'm not passive. I don't just kind of let life happen to me. And so when I say I let it happen to me, I used to believe that about myself with certain things that I experienced. Because, it's hard to say, I don't want to play the victim role and say I was just a victim, but then I also let it happen to me. So this is definitely one I've said as well. I should have known better. Right? Have any of you said that? That one also rings true for me. So why do we do this? Why do we blame ourselves when you were, quote unquote, the victim of trauma? Because we have a conscience. This is normal. We need to be able to distinguish between good and bad, doing the right thing versus the wrong thing. Very few humans on earth cannot distinguish between good and bad, and they usually have some sort of brain damage or serious mental illness. But we are made with the innate ability to decide between good and bad. We have a moral compass that guides our daily actions, that says, don't go do that because that's going to hurt someone, even if you feel like it right now. And this is what helps us course correct if we make a mistake. That's where that healthy guilt comes in. This is how we know we are guilty of something, because we have a moral compass inside of us. So just know that this is really common when it comes to trauma. And if you remember back to the module where we talked about how the brain works with trauma, when our brains are firing properly, we can accurately assess whether or not we're at fault, because that prefrontal cortex, that rational part of the brain, is online and it's doing its job. It's assessing the rationality of the situation, and it's logical. But if you remember what I was saying about how memories are stored with our traumas, that prefrontal cortex was out to lunch. And so the trauma creates those improper memory storage files. And the activated sympathetic nervous system with the epinephrine and cortisol release that was happening. Remember, prefrontal cortex not around, not helping us out. So our brain can't logically address the blame related to trauma. So if we think back to that traumatic event and you pull out that memory file, it's not logical. And the logical part of your brain wasn't engaged in that experience. So we often have trouble assessing whether we should assign blame or not, because our moral compass wasn't working. So I also want to note that if your trauma happened as a kid, this is even more pronounced because our brains aren't even fully developed at kids. The prefrontal cortex is constantly developing over the course of our life, in the teenage years especially. So if a trauma happened to you as a kid, your brain wasn't even fully functioning when that trauma happened. It wasn't even fully developed. And so it's really hard, and we assign a lot of blame to traumas, especially if it happened to us at a very young age. So now when blame turns to shame, remember I said that that self-blame or that guilt can turn into shame when it's not addressed, and it creates that root. This happens when it's not addressed, when we don't work through it, or we can't put that logic into our traumatic memory. So we start to believe we are inherently bad, unworthy, flawed, etc. And then we sometimes take on shame when it's someone else's fault. I don't know if you have experienced this, I have, but in unhealthy, abusive relationships, gaslighting, that's essentially what gaslighting is. It's the other person avoiding the attention on whatever issues they have and projecting it onto the other person to make them out to be like they're crazy or that there's something wrong with them. So it comes out a lot of like statements of like, you have problems with this, you struggle with this, like there's something wrong with you, you need to go see a therapist or a coach, you need to get this fixed. Like it's a lot of projection of what that person is actually needing to do themselves that they put onto you to make you feel like you're crazy. The definition of gaslighting actually came from a movie made years ago where a man basically made his wife out to be like she was completely crazy. Like she actually got the treatment, psychotic treatment, because he used basically words to make her feel like she was completely crazy. That's where this term came from. So we can take on shame when it's not even anything ours to carry. Like, I mean, the stuff that my ex-husband would tell me about my appearance, I was not an unattractive. I was very tiny. My ex-husband was very large and struggled with body weight issues and body image issues. And he would project all of that onto me so that I thought I was ugly, I was fat, I was all of these things when it was never actually true. But I inherently believed those things about myself, which is how I took on that shame. And this is, again, an example of how trauma has impacted my brain and for me to start to believe those things about myself and where that deep root of shame took place. So where does shame come from? I mean, how can we stop this root from being formed? Everybody experiences shame at some point. I'm not saying we're going to go through life and never experience shame, because it's just fundamentally going to happen at times when we allow guilt to kind of set in, or we experience maybe some unhealthiness with a relationship. But when guilt turns to shame is really when it resonates with a core belief about ourselves that we developed in childhood. For this exercise, I want you to think about which of these emotions you feel when you are experiencing emotional pain. This is not an all-encompassing list, it's a long list, but I want you to think about some of these emotions and which ones really ring true for you. When I did this exercise, unloved was a big one for me. Unworthy also ranked up at the top. Inadequate also really spoke to me. And some people might really feel like some of these are, oh gosh, that one really rings true. Others are like, no, I don't really feel that. So I want you to really kind of sit with this list and go through it. And when you experience emotional pain, and what does that mean? Emotional pain is when you are feeling that shame, when you really let the shame sit in there and it's like eating at you inside. Which of these emotions comes up for you when you experience that is how I want you to think of this. And then I want you to dig into this in the workbook. When was the first time you remember feeling that emotion? You might have to go really far back. This might bring up an event. This might bring up something that happened to you. So I want you to do this exercise when you're in a safe place and you have time to really process. When I did this exercise, some memories came up that I never remembered, and it was really traumatizing. And so I just want you to also remember that grounding technique in case something like that happens to you. But just thinking about this, was there an event that happened? When is the most recent time then that you felt that way, and what happened? When you can finally start to identify the core belief, you can start to reframe it in your mind. So I want you to also thinking about what core beliefs did you write down? Do you see any false beliefs in your I am statements? This is a really deep exercise that you're going to have to unpack, and I want you to give yourself time to do it because it can bring up a lot of stuff when you start to get down to that root of shame. And just know that it's okay. Process it. This one might take you a little while. That's okay too. But just know that a lot of times when we have that deep root of shame, there's an I am statement that goes with it, and then one of those core beliefs or emotions that's actually a false belief. So when you go to reframe your mind about this stuff, and this is again an activity you're going to do, but it's not going to change overnight. You're going to go back to that list of I am statements, and I want you to physically cross out the negative ones that you wrote. And think about what core belief is underlying that negative statement about yourself. And go back to that list of core beliefs and say, I see the unworthy core belief come up a lot in a lot of things I say, a lot of things I think about myself. And then I want you to rewrite the statement to a positive core belief. And just know that this exercise is just an exercise, but it's the repeating of these phrases that really starts to make a difference and get at that root of shame. Now I want to jump topics a little bit into secrets. And why do we talk about secrets with shame? Most people have shame that have secrets because that's how shame likes to keep secrets. So here's an example list of some of the secrets maybe you have, maybe you know somebody has: sexual abuse, engaging in internet porn, verbal abuse, suicidal thoughts, struggling financially, alcohol abuse, homosexuality, stealing, infidelity, abortion. There's a lot of secrets that people keep, and I'm not saying to go air your secrets to everybody to get at that root of shame, but just know that if you are holding secrets, there's probably a lot of shame associated with that. And the reason we do that is because we don't want people to know our business, right? Like we don't want people to know our secrets. There's a reason they're called secrets. And we often keep things a secret because we carry shame around it, because I'm ashamed of engaging in that activity. I used to struggle with I abused alcohol, and I also used to struggle with sex and porn addiction. And I very openly will share that now with people because I realize how much shame I had around it. And now that I am free from that, I'm not going to let it take hold over me anymore. And when I do start to have those thoughts come up or those urges, I immediately talk to someone about it. It's amazing how sharing that I'm even struggling with the thought of that again lessens the power it has over you, because shame wants to keep you in that place. So when we can share our secrets with someone who's a trusted friend, it lessens that power that shame has over you, and it creates an atmosphere for healing. You can even find accountability in that trusted friend to help you when you are struggling and saying, you know what, if you recognize these symptoms in me, I want you to ask, is there something that you're keeping a secret that you want to share and you want to release that shame? So in this exercise, again, you don't have to share this with anybody, but there might be secrets that you desperately just want to tell someone. And I would encourage you to not share it with everybody, but to find people that you trust. It could be a coach, it could be, a family member or a friend, but just finding people that you can trust, because I guarantee once you start to share those secrets, the weight that lifts off of you when you do that, it's amazing. It's amazing how good it feels. And anytime that I am struggling with those urges to engage in those activities I used to do with sex, porn, overusing alcohol, I immediately go talk to someone, because it's like that secret that's starting to deep and get embedded inside me with shame is just finally lifted. The shame cycle, I mentioned this earlier, and the secrets that go along with it, this is what leads to destructive coping mechanism. Some examples of that are self-hate, you're performance-driven, you become a perfectionist, you struggle with depression, you have avoidance for activities, people, things, self-destructive behavior, addiction, and just keeping in mind it is such a cycle. So at the top of the cycle here, you see, I feel shame about something. I overused alcohol last night. Let's use that as an example. So a destructive coping mechanism. I'm going to go work out excessively until I can barely walk because I'm so mad at myself for doing that. Well, then I'm in pain, right, for working out excessively. And then I start to feel shame. Why did I beat myself up about that? I really didn't need to go punish myself by doing that. So you know what I'm going to do tonight? Now I'm going to go back to drinking because I'm so mad at myself that then instead of just acknowledging what I did and I ended up hurting myself in another way, now I'm either going to have a destructive coping mechanism going to come back, or I'm going to engage in a new one. So it doesn't have to look like, always hurting yourself when you are talking destructive coping mechanisms. But in the end, the whole point of these destructive coping mechanisms is it keeps you in the shame cycle. It keeps this going round and round because you initially felt shame about something, and instead of dealing with it, instead of working through that, figuring out why you engaged in that activity or whatever you feel shameful about, you end up with a destructive coping mechanism to punish yourself because you think you are bad. You think there's something wrong with you. And so this just keeps going and going and going, and it's such a perpetual cycle, and it's something I have struggled with for a long time. I have really battled with shame in a lot of areas of my life, and I can tell you that I've had some pretty destructive coping mechanisms as a result. Shame is one of the hardest emotions to work through because it is self-inflicted. And I just can't stress enough that if you've struggled with shame, it likely started in childhood with some false core beliefs. A lot of those false core beliefs that you chose from that list were instilled in you at a very young age, right? Those were maybe how you felt as a kid, and it's really hard to change those overnight. That's why the exercises in this module, as I mentioned, they might not take you that long to work through them, but to reframe your mind and to really pull out that root of shame takes a lot of work, and it's often one of the hardest things to work through. And it's going to take repeating those I am statements for maybe 3 months and maybe 6 months. It's going to take continually renewing your mind in this area. And as you do, you'll start to recognize when you're experiencing shame. And then you'll work to stop your destructive coping mechanisms. So it really starts to help, to figure out, where am I holding shame? What am I shameful about? What are my secrets? And then once you can start to work through those, then you'll start to recognize, okay, so I recognize the shame that came in, and now I recognize that I have a destructive coping mechanism that's keeping that shame cycle going. So it really can take a while, and that's okay. And just know that if it's related to your trauma, it might take a long time, and that's okay, because this is a really hard emotion to dig out that root. And I would encourage you to get help. I would encourage you to talk to a coach, come on group coaching sessions, and then sometimes it can really even be helpful to find to do the forgiveness exercise. The one where you sit someone down in front of you and you have that imaginary conversation, You might need to have that conversation with yourself, and you might need to walk through that other forgiveness exercise where you talk about who do you need to forgive, why do you need to forgive them, and what would forgiveness look like for yourself? Like, what would that really look like? And if you are struggling with shame, I want to encourage you to really go back to that forgiveness section and just think about it only in terms of you, of truly forgiving yourself for whatever it is you need to forgive yourself for. So how do we do this? Remember I said repeating those I am statements, the positive ones or the reframed ones every day for a while. It took me a long time before I started to believe those things. Saying them out loud makes such a difference too, because when you hear yourself say those statements, it makes a big difference rather than just thinking them. I actually have them written on my mirror and I repeat them every single day. And then recognizing when you're using those destructive coping mechanisms. Figure out what your healthy coping mechanisms are. How can you replace them when you notice that shame has come in? Instead of engaging in a destructive coping mechanism, how can you immediately say, nope, I recognize that, and I'm going to stop that from continuing? And what are my healthy coping mechanisms? And then giving yourself grace and patience, knowing that shame is a really hard thing to tackle, especially when it's instilled in us at such a young age in childhood, especially with childhood traumas. So just give yourself some patience through this stuff because it is hard work. Next up, we're going to talk about relationships and intimacy, and you'll see how a lot of the stuff we've talked about in these other modules just continues to weave into this, but we're really going to dig into boundary setting with people, recognizing the role you play in relationships. It's going to be really great stuff, so stay tuned with me, and thanks for joining me.